Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
There was a piece in the papers not very long ago by a quite well-known team in America who do neuroimaging, and they're particularly interested in moral values. And they found that by suppressing activity in the right temporoparietal region, they caused a failure to understand the nature of moral judgments. They set up a scenario of Grace hoping to put sugar in her friend's coffee, but actually, by mistake, putting poison in, and she died. In the other scenario, Grace intended to poison her friend, but put sugar in, and the friend lived. In the normal state, we probably think it was worse to intend to poison, but the good old left hemisphere, on its own, thought in what is basically an autistic way that the outcome was the important measure. But then these neuroscientists, I won't mention their names to spare them their blushes here, finished up by saying, if something as complex as morality has a mechanical explanation, it'll be hard to argue that people have or need a soul. So is the concept of the soul a redundant idea now that science has made us see it as a superstition? Or are we actually turning our backs on something very important simply because we can't satisfy demands for precision and proof? And in fact, are we making a category mistake? So I'm going to ask today two questions. What use is the soul as an idea? And I think I have an answer to that. I think it has a use. And I'm also going to ask, if so, what might the soul be like? And about that, I'm afraid, I am less certain. I expect a lot of us would sympathize with the soldier of Marlborough's before the Battle of Blenheim who was reportedly heard praying, "O God, if there be a God, save my soul if I have a soul." Nowadays it's become a kind of embarrassment to talk about the soul, and yet until now it has been central to most cultures. The word has disappeared, and language is an aspect of reality. If it's true, as Wittgenstein said, that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by language, making something disappear by language could bewitch us into thinking it didn't exist. Let's think in simple terms. Can this word be substituted? Well, it seems to me to place the person in a widest context, a context outside the confines of immediate time and space, and even to involve an idea of destiny. So, for example, Othello's great lines, "It is the cause, my soul, let me not name it to you chaste stars." It would be difficult to replace that with, it is the cause, my mind, my brain, my emotions. It seems that the concept has a meaning, which we can't exactly say what it is, but it, as I say, sets the human being in a broad context, not the narrow context of where we're encountering the person. And it seems to have this idea of a destiny. And so one gets the idea of Keats's, that the world is a veil of soul-making. What did he mean? He didn't mean that we grow up intellectually. He didn't mean that we got better at being moral citizens. He didn't mean that something happened to our heart, exactly. He meant something bigger and deeper. So is our sense of the spiritual something like our moral sense? Well, it certainly has something of that, but it goes beyond it, doesn't it? There's a rather marvellous moment in a play of Iris Murdoch's called Above the Gods. The character says, in a way, goodness and truth seem to come out of the depths of the soul. And when we really know something, we feel we've always known it. Yet also, it's terribly distant, farther than any star. We're sort of stretched out. It's like beyond the world, not in the clouds or in heaven, but a light that shows the world, this world, as it really is. But they put me in mind, she was a Platonist, of Plato's speaking of philosophy in the 7th letter. He says, for philosophy doesn't admit of exposition like other branches of knowledge, but after much converse about the matter and a life live together, suddenly a light, as it were, is kindled in one soul by a flame that leaps to it from another, and thereafter sustains itself. So thinking and moral reasoning are part of it, but what both those passages seem to suggest to me is there is something deeper, more transcendent, over which we have less power. So is it to do with emotion? That's another possible idea, because after all, we say soulful often means with emotion. You could say somebody is unhappy. You could say this is sadness. And in a way, that's right, depending on what we mean. The case of depression and so on is not really sadness. Is it perhaps a soul sickness? Psychiatrists, after all, the word means soul doctors. And in German, there was the idea that doctors were ministering to die Seele, which is a hard thing to define, but that's the point. We need a word that's hard to define, because if we define it, we'll probably miss the point altogether. Well, let's get a little bit less defined. It could be sort of imagination, something like that. And indeed, again, it often involves imagination, but it surely is other than that and goes beyond it. And there's plenty of imagination which is not in the service of the soul at all. In a book called Logos of the Soul by a follower of Jung called Christou, talking about Jung's idea of the soul, he comments, a person who spent his life in a cell may have enriched and deepened his soul. And this wouldn't mean, moreover, that he spent his time accumulating fantasies or writing learned treatises. It's probably more imaginative in the way that Wordsworth used the idea, become a living soul. There are overlaps there. Okay, it's not any of those things precisely, but could it be a something that stands over against our embodied existence? Well, I think there's two things wrong with that. The one is that it's not a thing, and the other is that it's not over against our embodied existence. Like matter, according to Whitehead and Bergson, the soul seems to me to be process, more process than a thing. We come back to the phrase, a veil of soul making. Perhaps not all souls are equal. Perhaps we have to grow our souls. Perhaps souls can be so thwarted that they're almost extinguished. And many people who've talked about the soul have used imagery of fire or water, which are things that are more like energy processes. For example, Eckhart's Fünkelein, the little spark, the scintilla animae, the soul spark, which comes from, corresponds to, and reaches out again to the divine. A potentiality, in other words, something in the process of happening, a latent function that needs to be nourished to grow and expand. Nowadays, it's not popular to say that there is a value to suffering, but it is part of the experience of suffering sometimes that it does deepen one's sense of what it means to be alive. A poet that I like very much, Henry Vaughan, well, he